Hello, and welcome to Akron, VA. I hope that you will enjoy this story. If you do, please leave a like and a comment. I would really appreciate it. To stay up to date on when new stories are released, feel free to subscribe and click the notification bell. This story takes place years before the events of Bloodbath. Like Bloodbath, it deals with various dark and somewhat gruesome topics. Listener discretion is advised. Without further ado, I implore that you listen and enjoy. Shelma was a simple woman by most counts. Her face was round and her figure wasn't what it used to be. Her hair was more white than it was blonde now, but her pale green eyes still shone with the brightness of youth. She was a mother, a seamstress, and one of Broken's faithful. Some people praised her for her humility and her willingness to be a good wife and mother, while providing for her family with her sewing. And she took that praise. Deep down, though, she had dreams. She knew she was destined for something greater. She had always felt it, always known it. But for now, she was just Shelma. Simple, humble Shelma. She picked back up the book she had been reading. The black leather cover read Tenets of Broken, a common religious and political text that was integral to the Broken Church. But the brown leather cover hidden beneath read something very different. Something she could get in trouble for just knowing about. Twisting Fates. The collected teachings and beliefs of the Morai witches and fate weavers. Shelma didn't understand why it was considered heresy. Morai was the goddess of fate. Shelma believed that fate and Broken's philosophy of order above all went hand in hand. What could be more orderly than controlling the very threads of time and fate themselves? Yes, Morai was a member of the ancient Woden pantheon, but Shelma knew the histories. She knew that Broken himself got much of his original power from the Woden gods when he served as a champion to one. Some people consider that knowledge forbidden as well, but it wasn't her fault that she loved to read. The Second Unification War scourged so much knowledge from the spheres. Shelma considered it her sacred duty to preserve as much of that information as she could. After all, it wasn't Broken who rooted out nearly all other religions from his territories. Before his apotheosis, he welcomed any and all beliefs, so long as they were willing to abide by his laws and tenets of order. It wasn't until after his apotheosis that his church grew fanatical and deemed all other beliefs heresy. Shelma did believe in Broken. How could she not? But she also believed that Broken would want her to learn as much about the world as she could, like he himself did. It wasn't like she worshipped Crom or Dawn or the damned Faden. Regardless of what the church might think of her if they knew, she was not a heretic. She was just curious. That's right, she was curious. A bell rang out in the lobby of her tailor shop. She sighed deeply and then put the book down. Less than an hour from closing and now someone decided to come in? Didn't they know she had work to do? The dresses that prissy noble lady had ordered weren't going to sew themselves. She stood up from her small wooden chair and walked out into the lobby. The room was empty. More than that, it was dark. No light but the pale blue of the enchanted lamps on the street outside. She was sure she had left a few candles burning. How long had she been reading? The sky outside was dark too, she noticed as she looked out the window to the street beyond. Now she would have to come up with an excuse to tell her fool of a husband when she came home late again. She looked up at the bell that hung above the door. It was flipped upside down. Someone must have slammed the door open to cause the bell to spin that far. But the door was locked. That was right. She had already closed up the shop a few hours ago. She just wanted to finish the chapter she was reading before she went home. Why was it so hard for her to think? To remember? "What is your name?" a low, cold voice asked. Shelma jumped and turned around to face nothing. There was nothing there, just shadows dancing from the pale light outside. Maybe reading about gods and monsters so late at night was a bad idea after all. She was starting to imagine things. "What is your name?" She started and turned around again, searching the room for where that cold voice was coming from. She wasn't imagining things. She had heard that voice, hadn't she? "Broken's light shine upon me. Broken's order guide my path. Broken's steel protect me, his sword my defense." She recited the warding prayers that all the citizens of the Broken Empire knew, calling for his favor and blessing. "Broken is not your name," the disembodied voice shouted. She felt as if the voice itself had enough physical presence to knock her back against the thin windowed door. "What is your name?" the voice whispered gently from behind her. Tears began to stream down her face. Her heart threatened to beat out of her chest. She would never read those fake cursed books again, she swore it. She would swear anything right about now. With her hands clasped around her own throat, trying to force herself to breathe, she slowly turned her head to look out the door's window. There was no one on the other side. No one but her own reflection. And something else. Something behind her. Something so wrong, so dark, that her brain could not justify what she was seeing at all. The world around that thing became blindingly bright by comparison. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it. Part of her didn't want to. It was terrible and beautiful. It was like her eyes were opened for the first time, like she was staring through a window into the veil or the other world itself. As she stared deeper into the abyss, she couldn't help but feel like something was staring back at her. Eyes. Glowing eyes, red with hatred. Or maybe it was love. She no longer knew if her tears were of fear, pain, or joy. Pain. There was pain, as if her eyes had been replaced with searing coals, but she couldn't stop staring. "What is your name?" the window asked her emphatically. "Shelma," she finally responded through a choked breath. "Shelma. Shelma." It sounded as if the voice was tasting the name, savoring its flavor. "Yes, Shelma. Thank you, Shelma," it continued. Each time the voice spoke her name, it felt as if 1,000 sewing needles pierced every inch of her flesh. The pain was unbearable. She had never endured so much pain before. She shut her eyes and covered her ears. She tried to scream, but nothing came out. Then it all stopped. She hesitantly opened her eyes. The reflection was gone. The pain, nothing but a memory. Blood of Crom, she really was losing it. She turned away from the door and into the lobby. It was there. Not a reflection anymore. It was there. Her eyes bulged out of her head and her breath caught in her throat. She turned and ran for the door and fumbled with the handle, trying to lift the deadbolt. "Shelma." The word froze her in place. She couldn't move. She couldn't blink. She couldn't breathe. "Shelma." She flopped to the floor, still fully conscious but barely breathing. She couldn't feel anything anymore. No pain, no emotion, nothing. She glanced up at the grave blackness in the room. It began to swirl and shift and shrink, coalescing into a shape. Her shape. The mirror image of her stepped closer and knelt down to her. "What is your name?" she asked herself, but she couldn't remember. She couldn't remember anything. She smiled at herself as she stood up and walked into the blackness. Martonis walked the streets of Eldaroon, as he often did on the job. The tall stone buildings stretched towards the dark gray sky on either side of him. Raindrops dove from the tops of the buildings to the cobblestones below. He lifted the high collar on his long black coat and continued on. Eldaroon was the beating heart of the Broken Empire, and it looked the part. The dense city blocks were full of life, and the hard-cut Orden architecture was a sight to behold. It was said that all Orden craftsmanship was directly descendant from the Woden Empire, since they had been the Woden's primary workforce. Their techniques were a closely guarded secret, and their tools and methods could only be used by beings of their enormous stature anyway. Order was a fundamental tenet of Broken's philosophy, and nothing embodied that order more than the cities the Orden built for his empire. The Orden themselves were rarely seen in the Empire anymore, however. Many of them had retreated to their own fortresses and clans over the centuries following his apotheosis. Broken had always respected the Orden, but the same couldn't always be said for the citizens of his empire. And without his direct steel hand to keep people in line, humans grew progressively more fearful and hostile towards the Orden. Martonis liked the Orden. They rarely got into trouble with the Ministry on their own. Contrary to popular stereotypes, civilized Orden were surprisingly pacifistic, though several roving bands of exiled ravagers often painted them in a much more barbaric light. Someday, Martonis hoped to see an Orden city. He had heard that they were even more impressive than the ones built for Broken. He wasn't out for a leisurely stroll, however. He was on a trail. A string of brutal murders. A wife and child brutally flayed and killed. A shopkeeper with each of his fingers, toes, and limbs individually removed and pinned to a wall of his shop. Grotesque sights. 6 such murders in 3 weeks. Not the worst Martonis had seen, but certainly not pleasant. He had seen the like before, several years ago. Such brutal tortures were the mark of a sin-eater, also known as a painless. He hated dealing with painless. With other Fey-cursed, their minds and bodies were usually altered by the curse, or completely corrupted by the Faden. But painless kept full control over their minds. The curse itself would simply drive them mad over time, as such a condition would do to anyone. But that meant that what they did was a choice. They chose to be monsters. But in their place, what other choice did they have? There was another choice. A harder choice. One that few painless ever chose. But he knew of one. He stepped up to the door that read Mardalon Clinic in bright yellow letters. He reached for the handle and pushed his way through, brushing the water off of his jacket as he stepped inside. Dr. Asu stood in front of a young boy who was perched atop a tall examination table. The boy could be no older than 12. A woman, presumably his mother, stood nearby, while another woman sat in the lobby with her daughter, near womanhood herself, waiting for their turn. The young boy on the table had his pant leg rolled up to show a badly bruised knee. Asu prodded at it, evoking several winces from the child. Martonis took account of the room. Every door, window, scalpel, and saw, every bottle of medicine. One of the perks of being a keeper was the heightened senses and memory that Reaper provided. "Well, nothing is broken from what I can see," Asu said as he turned to grab a small vial of yellow liquid from a cabinet. "This is Almister root extract. It should take away the pain and heal the bruising in no time." He poured several drops from the vial into a white rag and held it to the boy's knee. Martonis watched as the man closed his eyes and breathed deeply. However, the boy's happy voice broke his concentration and startled the doctor. "It doesn't hurt anymore," the boy shouted triumphantly. A broad smile washed across the doctor's face. "Good, good. But that leg is still tender. Don't be jumping off any more roofs, you hear?" He scolded with a smile. "Yes, doctor." The boy slid off the table and walked to his mom, who reached into a small pouch and proffered several silver marks and handed them to the doctor. The doctor took the coins and handed the woman the vial of yellow liquid. "Twice a day when he wakes up and goes to bed. Just a few drops. Too much might give him a rash," he said with that same smile. "Thank you, Dr. Asu," the woman said with relief before herding her son out the door into the rainy street. Asu's eyes met Martonis's. "Please, take a seat. I'll be with you in a moment, sir," he said. Martonis took a step closer to the man, cold determination showing plainly on his face. "I would actually prefer if we could speak now," Martonis responded in as cool of a voice as he could manage. "I just need to see Miss—" "Now," Martonis interrupted. "I'm afraid I must insist, Doctor." Asu glanced to the side nervously for just a fraction of a second. "Of course," he replied. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Dravach. I'll stop by and check on Seely later. I apologize for the inconvenience." The woman stood up sharply with her daughter and cut Martonis with a sharp stare. "I need to clean up. I'll be just a moment. Please, make yourself at home," the doctor said, turning his back to Martonis and walking towards the large wash basin against the far wall. "Much obliged." Martonis watched as the man scrubbed his hands with a white wash rag in the basin. "So what can I do for you, Mr. Martonis?" "Ah, Mr. Martonis." "Just Martonis." The doctor dried his hands and very subtly laid the cloth over a scalpel that Martonis had noted when he first entered. Asu moved the rag and hid it behind himself as he turned around. Martonis barely caught a glimpse of the small piece of metal sliding up the man's sleeve. "Almister root," Martonis said dryly. "I was unaware that it dulled pain." Asu took a step closer to him and gulped deeply. "Well, it takes a special method of refinement to bring out those characteristics. It's a closely guarded secret of the Surgeons Guild." "Right. Reaper, the windows, please," he said to the air. The room grew darker as a thick shadow fell across the windows, blocking the view from the outside. It also grew a few degrees cooler, though barely enough for the average person to notice. The presence of a Faden in the mortal world did strange things. Fear crept across Asu's face, and he struggled to find the words. "What are you?" His shock gave Martonis the opportunity that he needed to reach out and grab the man's forearm, driving the scalpel into his flesh. Asu didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Martonis felt warm blood seep through the man's shirt onto his hand and begin to drip. Both men slowly looked down at the bleeding hand. "That looks painful," Martonis said, meeting Asu's eyes once again. Harsh realization spread across his face, which was replaced by resignation. "Ah. Yes." Asu gently removed Martonis' hand from his arm and returned to the wash basin to rinse his wound, discarding the scalpel to the side. "I'm looking for someone like you," Martonis said. Asu turned his head to face Martonis, skeptical as he wrapped a white bandage around his arm. "Not me? You aren't here to kill me." "No. I've known about you for years, Asu. If the Ministry wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. I'm looking for another Painless." Asu cringed at the word, as if he was being struck by it. I've never met another like me. By Broken, I swear it. Martonis turned his head slightly to the side, as if looking over his shoulder. Reaper. The room darkened even more, and a chill ran up Martonis' spine as the blood-curdling scream of the Faden pierced into his mind. He's telling the truth. Martonis could feel Reaper's red eyes peering out of his own, weighing the man. He could also feel Reaper's hunger, his need to devour. It was all he could do to stop himself from consuming the fey-cursed soul before him. With a shudder, Martonis regained control and resumed a level stare at the doctor. Not many of your kind handle your condition as well as you have. Why would I hurt people when I could help them instead? Use my curse as a gift. It is hard sometimes, the urge, the need. It's always there, but between what I do here and... He shifted nervously. Well, other things, I'm able to keep it at bay, if just barely. Martonis began to pace. What you and your wife do willingly is of no concern to me. Asu's eyes bulged, but Martonis continued. Now, do you keep records of your clients? Painless often flock together. It sometimes helps to be around others with the same affliction. My target may have come to you without you realizing it. Perhaps someone who didn't actually need treatment to begin with. Asu gathered himself. Yes, of course. He moved over to a nearby file cabinet, where several leather-bound volumes were stored. I keep a record of everyone I tend to, and there are many who need no treatment. Sometimes people come to me in order to get out of certain obligations. I make note of such clients. He sifted through the books and pulled out a thick one with lists upon lists of names. Here we are, Asu said, handing the book to Martonis. He and Reaper scanned through the lists and froze on a single name. Him, Reaper screamed into his mind. It appears so. Martonis held out the book and pointed to a single name. Do you remember this man? He asked. Yes, Asu replied. Young man. He came a handful of times, actually, always claiming a bad headache. I never felt anything when I tried to take his pain. Come to think of it, I honestly felt nothing. I almost always feel something, mild aches or pains, but not for him. Martonis swore under his breath. Thank you for your help. And sorry about your arm, he said. Not a problem, I heal quickly, Asu responded sheepishly. Keep up the good work, Doctor. But we'll be watching, just in case. Asu gulped deeply as Martonis smiled at him. Then he lifted his collar again and headed back out onto the street. Reaper's shadow that had perched unseen in the corner of the room followed after, letting light from the windows pour back into the room. Kill the Faden! Martonis heard the gathering crowd scream as he approached the increasingly violent gathering. Martonis hated mobs. They went against everything the Broken Empire stood for, so chaotic and volatile. No clear focus or intention, just blind rage and hatred. It had been nearly an hour since the sun went down, and the torches of the mob in front of them cast ominous shadows against the stone buildings. After meeting with the good doctor, he had stopped by the precinct to check in on a few things and follow a few leads, which finally led him here. He pushed his way through the growing body of people. His heightened senses picked out the sound of raindrops sizzling as they were vaporized by the torches of the screaming drones. Over the tops of heads, he saw a number of people gathered on a small stage at the center of the block. Several protectors barely kept the crowd at bay. On the stage stood an officer from the precinct, an officer that Martonis knew. He had been the husband of the mother and child that were brutally murdered several weeks before. He was holding a dagger above his head and shouting with the crowd. This mimic murdered my family. He cut my wife and baby boy to pieces, he shouted through tears. Mimic, Martonis mumbled under his breath.
You told the precinct you were after a mimic, not a painless.
Reaper's shrill scream cut through all of the noise around him. Oh, that was right. Painless were much more subtle as far as Faden were concerned. Martonis didn't want to scare away any potential suspects, so he made up a story about a mimic instead. He probably should have thought that through a little bit more. Kneeling at the feet of the officer was a middle-aged man. His clothes were torn, and he was bleeding from several long cuts, presumably made by the officer's knife. "I'm not a mimic!" he cried out through sobs of pain. "Quiet, Faden!" the officer shouted before kicking him in the ribs. Martonis winced as the man doubled over. He pushed through the front line of the crowd and past the protectors, who nodded as they recognized his face. He leapt up on the stage and shouted, trying to match the volume of the crowd.
"Everyone calm down!"
Nothing changed, other than the officers staring at him incredulously. He closed his eyes, only to see two piercing red eyes staring back at him behind his eyelids. He took a deep breath and shouted again.
"Quiet!"
The thunderous boom of his voice shook the buildings around them, and several torches winked out as the crowd fell silent. "Is this justice?" he called out in his normal voice.
"Torturing an innocent man in the street. Is this what Broken would have wanted?"
"He's a mimic!" one man called out.
"Where is your proof? This man is no mimic." "But there is a mimic here, in this crowd, and I intend to find him."
Gasps shook through the crowd. A shadow rose up from Martonis' own. It grew larger and larger as the crowd backed further away. Two flaming red eyes opened and cast the entire block into blood-tinted darkness. The crowd broke apart, screaming and running in every direction. Reaper gave chase, splitting his shadow into several forms and flowing down each of the side streets, pushing the mob away from the stage. After only a few seconds, only Martonis, the officer, and the protectors remained, standing over the whimpering body of an innocent man on the floor.
"You should probably make sure they don't go start a stampede or something,"
Martonis said to the protectors. They traded glances and then looked back at the officer.
"Go!"
Martonis shouted, and they obeyed. The officer stared at Martonis furiously as he knelt down next to the man lying on the floor of the stage. He unwound the ropes digging into his wrists and helped him stand.
"Go home."
Thank you, he said through tears before scurrying off into the night. The officer's face had softened slightly.
I don't know what came over me. People said they saw him shape-shifting, and I just couldn't stop thinking of my poor boy and wife. I was so overcome by grief and rage.
Martonis stared into the man's eyes.
"Happens to the worst of us." "You said the Faden was here, though. In the crowd. Your creature will find him, right? Right?"
The man was still holding his dagger tightly in his right hand.
"Let's give me the knife before someone else gets hurt, all right?"
The officer glanced down and took a step back, before reluctantly handing the blade over.
"You're going to find that Faden, right?"
he asked again. Martonis took a step closer to the man and placed a hand on his shoulder.
"I already found him,"
he said with eyes locked. Martonis let go of the dagger in his hand, letting it fall straight down and impaling the man's foot. He didn't blink. As if reenacting his earlier meeting with the doctor, they both slowly looked down at the blade protruding from the officer's foot. The man started and tried to jump back, but was pinned in place by the cruel blade.
"Wait, this This isn't what it looks like. I can explain.
He cried in desperation.
You can explain?
Martonis spat at the man.
Explain why you tortured and murdered 28 people? I checked in at the precinct. Had a nice conversation with the jailer, too. 22 prisoners, brutally murdered in the last year. I could almost accept that. Many of those men deserved it. A few deaths the jailer could sweep under the rug, but 22? They got suspicious. They started getting close, so you had to find new targets.
The officer started to cry and speak, but Martonis didn't give him a chance.
The first few were homeless people. People that no one would miss. No one would investigate. But then you got lazy. Why work so hard when you have a wife lying right next to you and a son in the next room? I didn't want to kill them,
he screamed.
You have no idea what it's like not to be able to feel anything other than the pain you take from other people. I had no choice. There is always a choice,
Martonis shouted.
It was your wife and kid, man. You could have become a soldier or a doctor, but instead you became a butcher. And not the good kind,
Reaper interjected in his mind.
And not the good kind,
Martonis repeated.
I'm sorry,
the man cried.
That won't bring your family back,
Martonis replied. The man struggled to pull himself together before speaking again.
So, what now? Are you going to kill me? Or are you going to wait for your pet to get back?
On cue, Reaper materialized from the shadows behind Martonis, his endless red eyes reflecting in the raindrops.
I never left,
Reaper screamed. The officer cried out in sheer panic, trying to pull his foot loose. The knife sliced through his shoe and the rest of his foot as he tore free and scuttled across the stage on his backside.
I do not envy you for what comes next,
Martonis spoke in a cool, hard voice.
I hear the fate that awaits a painless at the hands of a Reaper is cruel. 1,000 years of void. No light, no pain, no feeling. Just endless nothingness as your soul tears itself apart in the veil. I almost feel sorry for you. Almost.
Reaper sprang out from behind Martonis, and his shadow disappeared into the man's thrashing and screaming body. His eyes rolled back into his head, and his back arched. He screamed a low, guttural, and heartbreaking noise that sent shivers down Martonis' back. Then, it was over. The man's corpse dropped lifelessly to the stage. The blood from his foot flowed together with the rain. His lifeless eyes burned bright red for a second before Reaper's form rose from his shadow and merged with Martonis' own. It was done. Perhaps now all of his victims could have peace. "Do you know my name?" a feminine voice asked from behind him. He spun on his heels, and he heard Reaper make a pained hiss and scream from within his head, like a cat cornered in an alley with no chance of escape. In the center of the block, a woman stood alone in a puddle. She was middle-aged with white and blonde hair that was matted and wet from the rain. "Excuse me?" he asked the woman. "My name," she said. "Do you know my name?" Her face was blank of all emotion. "I've never met you before in my life," he replied. "Do not talk to her," Reaper screamed, more frantic than he had ever been before. Reaper's voice was always unnerving, but nothing had ever disturbed Martonis as much as the sound he made now. It was almost as if he was afraid. Martonis slowly began backing away from the woman. "Please, sir, I don't know where I am or who I am. Can you help me?" she asked with a sad approximation of sincerity.
Kill her. Kill her now.
No, Martonis retorted. I am not gonna kill an innocent woman. What has gotten into you?
Faden. She is cursed. She is cursed.
The fearful scream tore through Martonis' mind. When he glanced at the woman again, a thin smile stretched her lips.
Kill her.
Martonis hesitated for a second. A single second of indecision. He blinked, and the woman was gone. He looked down at the puddle where she had been standing. It almost looked like something was moving there, but it was impossible to tell with the rain splashing into the water. Martonis dropped down off the short stage and cautiously approached the puddle. Reaper made a constant low whimpering sound as he got closer. He gazed down into the puddle and was met with his own reflection in the rippling water. His eyes burned red with Reaper's power, but no. Reaper was cowering in the recesses of Martonis' mind. Those eyes were not his at all. In fact, they didn't even match up with Martonis' eyes exactly. It was like the light was shining through from an unknown source behind. He saw it. In the reflection, behind his head, was a writhing mass of darkness. Shadows folded in upon shadows, pulling each other deeper and deeper into an infinite abyss from where two burning, hateful eyes watched him. If Reaper's eyes were flames, these were entire stars of red fire. He lurched forward and turned around in time to see nothing. Had he imagined it? Nothing but rain fell from the black sky. He closed his eyes, trying to sense Reaper. He was there, of course, but faint, like a distant memory. He opened his eyes with a sigh, and there it was. Martonis' heart skipped a beat. An infinite doorway into the veil like he had never seen. He saw glimpses of worlds being torn apart, dying, gods fighting for their lives and falling under the teeth of Faden. He saw a man, a name, and then he saw nothing but the endless void of this unfathomable being. He tried to move, to speak, to do anything, but all he felt was fear? No, not fear. The being called him. It wasn't going to hurt. Pain. He felt pain. But not from this being. From himself. From Reaper. From their bond. Something was trying to force itself into a mind that had no spare room. He pushed back and fought to regain control.
Reaper, a little help here!
He screamed through gritted teeth. The shadowy door began to take form. He saw the woman from before, a confused expression across her face. He felt as Reaper's power burst to life inside of him, dominating every fiber of his being, filling every gap in his mind and body. He felt alive. He jumped back nearly 10 feet with a start, his eyes leaving faint trails of red glow. The being fully formed in front of him again, as a simple woman. No shadows, no burning red eyes, just a woman, sopping wet from the rain.
Reaper,
she said in a deep, cold voice that did not match her body.
Interesting,
she continued. Then, she was gone, vanished without a trace.
Where did she go?
Martonis shouted, looking around and then back down into the puddle.
It is gone,
Reaper said in the closest thing to a whisper Martonis had ever heard from him.
Where?
He demanded, but Reaper did not reply.
Where, Reaper?
He asked again, cold determination washing over him.
Back to the Veil. That woman is no simple Fae cursed. It is a host.
A host like you, the lingering silence seemed to say.
I thought Reapers were the only Faden that could bind hosts.
Martonis mumbled to himself, taking a step forward into the puddle. His boots splashed the shallow water away, but the increasing rain quickly replaced it.
We are the only Faden that bind willing hosts.
Martonis had learned a lot about Faden over the few decades he had been bound to Reaper. Many Faden could only influence the mortal world in subtle ways, a disease, a blight, a taint, but some could cause more active curses. Fey-cursed people like mimics or painless, nor the Faden responsible for them, had any real control over their curse, since it was just that, a curse. However, some more powerful Faden, whose minds and power were still relatively intact, were able to possess people, binding their very being and will to the host. Apparently, he had mistakenly believed that only Reapers were capable of such practices. He thought the distinction between willing and unwilling hosts would have been made clear to him, but he could no better understand the logic of a Faden than they humans.
Do you know what that thing was?
He asked the air.
It is not something we speak of,
Reaper finally said, after a few moments.
Well, you better start speaking of it, because I think it just tried to kill me.
Do not be foolish,
Reaper screamed.
The taker takes. It does not kill.
I don't know about that. It seemed pretty intent on taking my life,
Martonis shouted incredulously.
I did try to warn you,
Reaper retorted.
All you did was scream and hide like a little Faden girl. Do Faden have genders? I feel like I should know that.
His words turned more to a low mumble towards the end. He felt the rain seeping down his collar and soaking the back of his neck, which prompted him to begin walking down the alley.
Some of us do. Many have forgotten. Are you just going to leave that man's body there?
Reaper shouted at Martonis in confusion as he moved steadily down the alley.
Someone will find him sooner or later. I'm getting cold.
The next few nights crept on in an unusual silence. Word of the mob and the keeper that drove that mob away spread across the city like a dense fog. People knew about keepers, but they rarely showed such displays of power as Martonis had. The ministry had a few strong words for him and his theatrics, but he didn't regret what he did. The death of the officer slipped quietly under the radar in the face of everything else that had happened. Surprisingly, there had been very little crime or violence since. Of course, no one mentioned the absence for fear of breaking the odd silence. The city held its breath. There were no deaths, no robberies, but there was something worse. As the city slept, an ancient evil crept through the darkness. It was the darkness. Martonis heard strange reports of people wandering through the streets, forgetting where they were, forgetting who they were. A sickness of the mind was passing over them. People hesitated to leave their houses out of fear that they would forget their way home. The halls of the ministry headquarters in the city were quiet with anticipation. They knew the city was a pot ready to boil over. All it needed was a few more degrees. Martonis walked those empty halls, continually trying to pry information from Reaper. He knew that Reaper couldn't remember everything from his past. They had not been bound for that long, relatively speaking, but he remembered enough to be afraid. And anything that scared Reaper terrified Martonis. Individual keepers generally kept to themselves. They rarely ever talked, or even rarer would they actually work together. But Martonis didn't need help. He just needed information. He spoke with a few of the more senior keepers, asking them what they or their reapers knew about this growing threat. Information was scarce from them, and many of the few reapers had reacted in much of the same way as his own had. So, Martonis did something that he hadn't done in decades. He went to church. He used to go all of the time, since his late wife had dragged him and his son every week. But that was before, well, that was a lifetime ago. The rectory was a simple building. Simple compared to the other Orden-built towers that made up the rest of the city, at least. It was a large octagonal stone building, separated from the others nearby by a considerable distance. The top of the building was domed, with a large spire jutting from the corner facing him. A tall door was set into that spire, its frame ending in a point nearly 20 feet off the ground. Martonis approached the door and went inside. The simplicity of the building outside faded as he moved through the foyer. Strong wood braces ran up the domed ceiling of the main sanctuary chamber, carved in intricate and perfectly symmetrical detail. Inlaid polished steel lines ran throughout the entire building, glimmering brightly in the candlelight. A single man, wearing a long gray robe with a white stole draping down to his feet, was replacing several of the candles lining the walls. He appeared to be an older man, far younger than Martonis despite his own appearance, but he hadn't aged since he bound Reaper, so it wasn't exactly a fair comparison. "Rector," Martonis said in a low voice. The man lifted his head from his chore and looked towards Martonis. He looked him up and down, then his eyes squinted slightly in recognition.
"Ah, Keeper, what can the rectory do for the ministry today?"
He said ministry with a tinge of distaste. The different governing bodies of the Broken Empire rarely got along. The governors and nobles thought themselves above everyone, though they had very little actual power. They controlled the laws and the governing of the state. The Church of Broken took charge of the people. Out of all, they probably had the most actual power through their zeal and their influence over the sacred paladinic order. Then there was the Ministry of Investigation. The ministry pulled it all together. They did the things that no one else was willing to do, and made a lot of enemies in the process.
"I'm doing some research," Martonis said. "I'm looking for information about a particular Faden."
The rector was taken aback at first.
"You are a keeper. You have one of the broken, forsaken creatures in your head. What could you possibly have to ask me?"
he asked in mild aggravation.
"The creature in my head is being difficult right now."
Reaper rumbled his disapproval in Martonis' mind as he spoke.
"A Faden abomination from the Vale is being difficult. I would never have imagined," the rector stated. "I'm not in the mood for philosophical or religious debate right now, Rector. I just need some information. Lives are at stake here." "You are right. I've forgotten myself. My apologies, Keeper."
The man spoke with reluctant sincerity. The rector brought Martonis through the 2 rows of curved pews and past the podium as they spoke, through a small door and into a library beyond. The rector motioned to a chair for Martonis to sit.
"So this Faden that you're searching for, Taker, you said its name was?"
the rector asked while thumbing through multiple books on a nearby shelf.
"That was the name I've heard referring to it." "Describe it for me,"
he pried. Martonis explained in great detail the strange shadowy form he had seen, as well as the actions of the woman who was presumably its host.
"This is a very old thing,"
the rector finally said, still searching through the volumes.
"The church has documented many fey beings since its formation. The Wilt, the Painless, Karna in Worms. This entity has not been recorded since. But perhaps..."
He set down the volume that he was holding and walked over to a steel box set into one of the bookshelves. He produced a silver key from under his robe and used it to unlock the box, withdrawing several far older tomes than anything that occupied the rest of the library. Setting them at a desk, he began gingerly leafing through the archaic books.
"What are those?"
Martonis asked. The rector looked up concernedly.
I'm afraid I must swear you to secrecy. The oaths of binding that the Church took upon our Lord's apotheosis forbade us from sharing these texts with the ministry. I would not be doing so if I didn't believe that it was of the utmost importance. The Church is not blind to what has been happening out there in recent nights. This is an ancient evil, and our faith alone will not protect us, he said firmly. Do you swear it? I swear it,
Martonis said, and he had no intention of breaking that oath. Martonis stood from his wooden chair and walked over to the desk. The rector sighed deeply before continuing.
Before our Lord Broken's apotheosis, he was fascinated by history. As such, he sought out to find and preserve the oldest texts and accounts of history he could find.
He placed his hand on the stack of old books.
These tomes were written by Sadeki monks in the early days of the Fourth Age. They document many strange sightings from within the veil and the otherworld. How they recorded such things is unknown, but many of the theories that Lord Broken developed of the Faden, soul-binding, and enchantment came from texts such as these.
Martonis was taken aback by this revelation. Why would information about the Faden be withheld from the ministry, the very organization Broken himself had founded to hunt down such creatures? The ministry could have accomplished so much with that information, even developing new types of... Then he understood. These texts were not the only ones that Broken had preserved. As a keeper, he knew that the ministry itself had several volumes of literature that they were instructed to safeguard and keep from the other branches. Though he did not know the information that they contained, he assumed it was to ensure that the other branches didn't gain more power or advantage of knowledge over the others. Why did he expect anything less from the church, or the governors for that matter? If the ministry had had this information, they would have tried to bind other Faden and make more keepers than they were allowed by the contract between the Reapers and Broken. The realization pained him in a way he couldn't fully articulate, but it also gave him an even greater respect for Broken and the systems he had developed.
Ah, here we are,
the rector continued after finding a spot he was searching for.
This legend speaks of a host of shadows, an army of deadly, Faden creatures seen assaulting a Woden citadel in the otherworld. The legitimacy of these claims is unconfirmed, but they claim that these shadow creatures had more intelligence and structure than any other Faden recorded.
Martonis knew from stories that the Faden who appeared in the mortal world were only reflections of their true form and potential, as seen in the veil in the other world. What may be seen as a curse of disease or blight in the mortal world could appear as an unfathomable beast of terrifying destruction in the other world. But he also knew that these beasts rarely had minds of their own. Their only intention when breaking into the other world was to devour and destroy.
I bring up these legends because they speak of this army having a king, a being of terrible power and influence. It was said he could kill a god by just speaking their name. And so, in Sadek legend, he was referred to as the Taker of Names, or, more simply, the Nameless.
Reapers screamed in pain at the mention of these titles. Martonis felt his skin crawl, as if his blood itself was boiling and writhing in pain. He staggered back and reached for his chair for support.
Are you all right, Keeper?
The rector asked, concern marking his face.
Yeah,
Martonis said through shaky breath.
I guess that name struck a nerve with Reaper.
He forcibly regained his balance and shook his head clear of the violent vertigo that had assaulted him.
I'm all right. Please, continue.
Do not continue.
Reaper shouted from the depths of his mind.
I will show you.
Martonis blinked in surprise.
Actually, I need a moment,
he said to the rector, and then walked over to the side of the library.
So now you want to talk,
Martonis said to Reaper, unable to hide his aggravation.
Fine, talk.
He felt Reaper emerge from his deep subconscious and flood his mind and senses.
I did not say I would talk. I will show you.
Martonis' eyes went blindingly red. Then he faded into darkness.
I do not remember everything. Our bond is still young, and memory is difficult here in the Vale,
Reaper said. The darkness around Martonis began to ebb and flow and change, swirling together as clouds of shadow, streaked through by bolts of red and pale purple lightning that carried on for an eternity. This was the Vale, or at least part of it. The Vale took many different forms across its infinite landscapes, always shifting and changing. Few people had ever seen the Vale and lived to tell about it, though some believed that people's minds could drift here in their dreams, yet memories made there fell away like water. Martonis had seen it many times, as had all keepers. Once in full when he was first bound, but any time they used their powers, they glimpsed the vast, chaotic emptiness of the Vale. This was the first time since his binding that his mind had been there fully. Through the streaks of colored lightning, he saw shapes in the infinite distance, massive writhing tendrils and forms of deep shadow that even the light didn't illuminate, shapes he could not believe nor understand. Closer to him in the expanse, light began to form and move and change, a window in a swirling vortex of shadow. He was seeing into the past.
Watch,
Reaper said from behind him. Martonis saw what must have been the same thing the rector had described before, a massive army of shadowy creatures bursting through a rift in the air itself out into an alien landscape. It was a world that he had never seen before, colors vibrant and awe-inspiring. Massive trees and mushrooms and crystals sprang up in every direction across the brilliant land. Floating islands lazily floated by, and in the middle of all of it, a host of shadows carved a path of destruction. They looked like Reaper, only much larger and more chaotic. Massive black shapes with infinite burning coals for eyes. Everywhere they stepped, the ground turned to shadow. At the head of this army was a being far more imposing than any other. His form was different, more fluid and incomprehensible. The Reaper-like creatures appeared to be made of shadow. This being, however, was not just shadow as the absence of light. It was actively consuming the light and everything around it. It was an abyssal window of death and infinite darkness. They fought against creatures of every kind, massive antlered beasts and hounds with manes of fire, stone Goliaths and flowing waters in the shape of men. The window into that other time and place faded and was replaced by another. He watched as that same army battered itself against the Vale, trying to break free into the mortal world beyond. Every once in a while, one would succeed, shadowy Faden breaking fully into the mortal world, causing unmatched destruction and death. He tasted their hunger, their desire, and from their leader he tasted pure glee and also rage, feeding off of the souls of humans. The window changed again. A vast shifting darkness stretched before him. The Vale. Within it, he saw thousands of glowing eyes, surrounding one, with eyes burning even brighter still. For a moment, he could feel as these creatures began to remember. The souls they had consumed from the other Faden, human, and creatures of the otherworld empowered them, and they remembered. They were not always Faden. He watched as their memories grew, showing glimpses of their fight against their Woden oppressors, using their own magic against them. At their head stood their leader, a cruel look in his eye. His followers looked at him with hatred and fear, but they followed him. Then the vision faded.
When we became what we are, he took our names, our freedom. He controlled us, but we broke free. We swore oaths to avoid him. He swore oaths to destroy us and everything else in his path. Now he has found us, and we are afraid.
Reaper said hesitantly. How do we stop him? Martonis asked.
If we knew that, we would have done it.
Martonis blinked, and the veil was gone. He was back in the rectory library, but the rector was nowhere to be seen. Rector? Martonis called out, but there was no reply.
Something seems wrong.
Reaper screamed. Yeah, no kidding. Martonis agreed. He stepped up to the desk and peered down at the book. A single word jumped off the page at him. A name. It looked familiar to him, but he didn't know why. It was hard for his brain to read the word or comprehend its meaning. He reluctantly closed the book and walked out of the library. The rector was standing right in front of the door, staring at Martonis, unblinking, a thin smile across his face. Rector, are you all right? Martonis asked, looking around cautiously. The man blinked as if waking from a trance.
Yes, quite all right. Say, I never asked for your name, did I?
Martonis felt Reaper shift defensively in his mind. I'm a keeper. You're a rector. Let's just leave it at that, all right?
As you say, Keeper. I just think it was very rude of me not to have asked before.
The rector's eye took on a dangerous cast.
And of you not to give,
he finished. I need to be going now, Martonis said, slowly stepping past the robed man. The rector grabbed Martonis' arm with inhuman strength.
Why the rush? There's still so much for you to learn.
He said the last words through gritted teeth. Martonis almost caught a dim red glow in the man's eyes. Now, Reaper! Martonis called angrily. He felt Reaper's being expand throughout his own, strengthening him, empowering him, feeding on him. His mind began to fall away, replaced by something else, something darker. He looked out at the world through burning red eyes. The rector's eyes bulged as Martonis grabbed him by the throat and threw him into the nearby podium. He realized for the first time that they hadn't been alone in the room. Near the back of the sanctuary hall, a pale, disheveled woman with blonde and white hair stood, staring at them. Martonis locked eyes with her, and she screamed, a rageful, hate-filled scream that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The candles went out, leaving them in pitch blackness. Two red eyes glowed dimly in the distance. What is your name? The woman's voice asked. Reaper's power boiled within him, urging him to move, to kill. What is your name? Two voices asked this time, one belonging to the rector. Through Reaper's enhanced eyes, he could see several shapes moving through the far doorway behind the woman. Glancing into the veil, he could see black tendrils of shadow trailing from these shapes, arching upwards and connecting to the woman. Only her eyes glowed, but he could feel the eyes of the others boring into him.
What is
your
name?
What is your name?
An unholy choir of voices asked, clawing their way into his mind. One of the shapes had come closer to him. It was mere feet away. Who had this person been before falling into the Nameless's trap? A father? A daughter? A barmaid or footman? Martonis was glad that he couldn't see all of their faces. It would make this next part much easier. The shape in front of him lunged for his throat. He deftly moved to the left, narrowly avoiding the person's grasp. He felt Reaper crawl through his arm and down his fingertips. He could feel his black, shadowy form burst from his skin into claws and spikes that he used to tear through the person who had attacked him. The body fell lifelessly to the floor, and the shadowy tendril that had connected it to the woman faded.
What is your name?
The growing multitude screamed in unison. They rushed after him. He darted between their wild flails, his own hands striking true through each as he passed, tearing limb from limb, flesh from bone, soul from body. Stray fists and fingernails met his flesh, clawing and scraping. Cold pain ran through his body. It felt as if he was being pierced by thousands of spikes of ice. The tendrils retreated from each one he killed as he worked his way through the onslaught towards that woman. The ice chilled him to his bones. More shadowy figures moved through the still open doorway, crashing and thrashing their way into the mob.
What is your name?
The words pierced through his ears, ringing over and over in his mind as he fought for his life. He was filled with blind rage as he tore through the waves of flesh. Bodies of men, women, and even children threw themselves at him. He had no idea the curse had spread to this many people. 12, 16, 23, 29. He killed and killed. Poor, innocent people, corrupted by an evil that they couldn't understand or fight against. His stomach turned as he flung a small body across the room. Just a few more feet and he would be there. Just a few more feet. The woman began to rise up off the floor, tendrils trailing from her. She pulled on those tendrils, drawing the life force of those poor people into her. Shapes began to drop as their souls were taken, leaving cold husks behind.
What is your name?
A lone, demonic voice screamed from the woman. Shadow erupted from her flesh, flowing in on themselves, growing, moving, changing. Her body was torn apart as a vortex of shadow and endless darkness formed. Even the pitch-black room seemed to glow brightly by comparison. The endless doorway into nothingness called to him. He saw into the darkness, catching glimpses of a life. A woman cutting cloth, tucking her children into bed. A tyrant leading a charge across a desolate wasteland. A name. The name seemed familiar. He blinked, and the doorway shifted. Two burning red eyes, filled with malice, stared out at him. "Are you with me?" Martonis asked Reaper.
Let's finish this.
He screamed in response.
What is your...
Martonis cut off the creature's scream by breaking into a sprint and jumping straight through that impossible doorway. Martonis felt power surge through him as he entered the veil. Not just his mind this time, but his entire being. He also felt pain as Reaper's mind was violently ripped away from him. He felt his memories begin to drift away. This was not the Nameless's doing, but the effects of being fully in the veil, completely unshielded. If he spent too much time here, he would lose himself. In front of him, in the infinite rolling and shifting of clouds of shadow, opened two eyes, each larger than the sky itself, burning with the intensity of 1,000 suns.
Fool!
The eyes shouted.
You have no power here. You are mine.
Tiny traces of light of all different shades and colors floated around the eyes and swirled into the furnace. Martonis could feel them, each one a soul the Nameless had taken. each one a life. Beside him, he felt a familiar presence. He glanced over and saw two much smaller red eyes. They looked at him and nodded.
We've run from him for too long. This ends now.
Before he finished speaking, small red eyes began opening all around them. Infinite burning pinpricks of light. Hundreds of pairs, the same rage boiling within them, but their rage was directed at the Nameless. The Reapers. Martonis had never seen more than one or two others at a time, and only under very rare circumstances. Broken's contract only allowed for 10 to be bound to keepers at once. This was more than just bound Reapers. This was all of them, coming from across the Veil to fight for vengeance.
Impossible!
The Nameless shouted. The Reapers screamed in unison, throwing their power against him. But it wasn't enough. It held him at bay, but he was too powerful. Slowly, the Nameless began to speak names with hatred. Names that Martonis could not understand, but he knew that they were the names belonging to the Reapers, taken from them so long ago. As he spoke their names, their eyes blinked out in eruptions of red light. Martonis gritted his teeth. He felt powerless, hanging there weightless in the veil, his memories flying away just out of reach. He had to do something. This creature was the taker of names? Well, he would give him a name. 2, if he could just remember the other.
Martonis!
He shouted with all his might. Every red eye in the veil fixated on him.
No!
He heard a familiar voice shout.
You want my name, Taker? Ask me again. I will give you a name.
The massive red eyes boiled and fumed with hatred as they drank him in.
What is your name?
It asked in a soft, cold voice. Martonis spoke a name that he forgot as soon as he spoke it. Not his name, but another name. A name he had glimpsed the first time he had seen this abomination. A name he had briefly seen in the Rector's book. A name he had seen, but couldn't read or understand. When he spoke it, he spoke more the feeling of the name rather than the word itself, for he did not know the word. The name. The true name of the Nameless. He didn't exactly know how he even knew that's what it was, but he did know. The word seemed to take on form as it drifted slowly towards the creature. It writhed in pain as it tried to back away, to run, to flee, but the Reapers held firm. He felt the creature scream as the word washed over it. Its flaming red eyes burned and shifted, folding in on themselves, until only the memory of them remained. The veil itself stood still in stunned silence. Hundreds of red eyes turned to look at him. Then slowly, one by one, they each closed in turn, until only one pair remained. Martonis blinked, and he was standing in the center of the rectory, blood on his hands, bodies surrounding him on all sides. One of the bodies moved. A woman with blonde and white hair pushed herself up to a kneeling position from where she was laying. He blinked again, peering into the veil, but no shadow wrapped her this time. No red light shone from her eyes. What cruel fate allowed this woman to survive when everyone else here had died? He walked towards the door. Excuse me, the woman called. Do you know my name? Martonis stopped, but didn't turn to look towards her. No, he responded solemnly. Shelma, she whispered. I think my name is Shelma.
Your guess is as good as mine, lady,
he said. Then he walked out the door.